So good afternoon, everybody. We are delighted to welcome Merilyn Moos today. The title of her talk is Breaking the Silence. Merilyn Moos is a daughter of refugees from Nazi Germany. They were active anti-Nazis and fled early, but their families were generally not so lucky. Merilyn was brought up in silence about her family's past. She will be talking about finding out about that past and how retirement that led her to write a number of books about her family and what it means to be a second generation. Marilyn, welcome, and the stage is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted. Okay, I'm going to speak for, I don't know, roughly 20 minutes, might be a bit more. And then I'm hoping that there will be a discussion and people can ask me questions and we'll proceed like that. So I'm reading my speech because I haven't mastered the technology of reading it off the screen. So please forgive me. And I'm going to start by talking about myself and then about how I came to write a couple of my books. I'm the child of parents who fled Nazism early because they were active opponents of the Nazis, especially my father, Ziki. He fled on the night of the Reichstag fire. Though they didn't know it, my parents were never to see almost any of their families again. I was born in Oxford, but grew up in Durham, so quite close to Scotland. In fact, actually, Scotland seemed to me to be closer than London. That's not actually part of my talk, but still. And I was brought up in silence. My parents, who were both highly articulate people, became dumb when it came to answering questions about their lives in Germany or about themselves. So I stopped asking questions because of the silence or indeed hostility it provoked. If I was told anything, I gradually realized it was most probably a lie or at best an evasion. My mother especially had stuff she wanted to hide. Her sister had been one of the first to be murdered under the euthanasia program, and she never stopped feeling guilty that she hadn't done more to stop this happening. There's a whole backstory to that. I mean, I should have said really she was one of the first people who were Jewish to be murdered under the euthanasia program. She had also deserted her parents to their terrible fates when she fled to Britain in 1933. A few years later, in 1936, she went to the USSR to visit an Irish lover, which then contributed to his murder in the gulags. And that, again, there's a whole backstory too. My mother's inability to speak of the past strangled much chance of intimacy between her and me. My father traveled lighter, I mean psychologically lighter, but also had terrible secrets he did not want revealed. Once, when still little, I found a photo album. When I asked him who a young boy was, a photo of a young boy, he snatched the album out of my hands and stormed out of the room. I learned my lesson and didn't ask questions, but this all left me fearful to say anything and feeling that I was always in the wrong. Once a parent doesn't want to tell their child about the key event in their lives, it then becomes difficult for them to talk about anything at all. I suspect my parents justified their silence by thinking they were.
Sorry, we can't hear you. You muted yourself somehow. You need to unmute again.
Okay, that's very odd because I didn't touch anything. Can you hear me?
Yes, fine.
Where did I stop being heard?
Right.
You know, I'll start the previous paragraph again. So excuse me if you've already heard this. Okay. My father traveled lighter, but he had terrible secrets he didn't want revealed. When I found a photo album and asked him about the people in it, he just stormed out of the room. So, you know, I just learned not to ask questions, and it became very, very fearful. And I kind of felt that I was always in the wrong. So once a parent doesn't want to tell their child about the key events in their lives, it then becomes difficult to talk about anything. I suspect my parents justified their silence by thinking they were protecting me. They wanted me to be a good, assimilated English girl. And I say English, knowing I'm talking to a Scottish audience, but I think that's what they thought. They wanted me to be a good, assimilated English girl. They did not want me encumbered by the horrors of their past. But more than anything, I suspect they were protecting themselves from unbearable memories. But their silence left me without a history. I knew something wasn't right, even when little. The front door had 5 locks, always in use. Even the individual rooms had locks on the door. My father was convinced he was being spied on. My mother didn't want to leave the house and sometimes hardly wanted to leave the bedroom. That's my parents' bedroom. They were terrified something awful would happen to me. I could talk about that. They did not want me to have friends to the house or me to go to my friends' houses. I had a lonely childhood. I made friends with books and my dog, my beloved dog, and started when still little writing stories. Having the doors to my own history shut tight against me left me both ignorant of my roots and lacking a sense of who I was. I knew nothing of any of my grandparents or wider kin. I did not even know their names. People don't believe me, but I didn't. I knew nothing of my parents' lives in Berlin. Silenced by secrets, I grew up feeling that I was living with ghosts. I don't mean flappy things. I mean the ghosts, the memories of people who I felt actually sort of occupied the house. At the same time, I absorbed many layers of cultural capital from my parents. Their bookshelves were full of wonderful European classics, which they gave me to read in English. My father, an economics lecturer at Durham University, spent his spare time painting inspiring and powerful expressionist pictures, which then adorned the walls of our house. My mother cooked delicious European food. Our daily diet was pumpernickel, sauerkraut, and wurst, pork and beef. Without knowing it, I became immersed in European culture. To my own surprise, I got into Oxford University and then afterwards became a lecturer. I became a union activist and an anti-racist. Before I wrote about the impact of Nazism, I had lots of articles published about post-16 education policy. I shall also mention, because I see gender as relevant to my experience, that I had a child late, and as it turned out, became a single mother. That wasn't actually my choice, but that's what happened. I was very busy. It took me till late middle age to finally dare to start to open the door onto my past. Long after my father's death, when my mother was in hospital, I finally raided their home. There I discovered piles of documents. Amongst much else, I found 2 envelopes stuffed with fragile, musty sheets of tissue thin paper, often covered with tiny, almost illegible German writing. These were heartbreaking letters from my mother and father's families, written to my parents between 1936, I don't know what happened to the earlier letters, between 1936 and 1942. They had to be translated, and you can guess why they stopped in 42. They had to be translated from the German for me. Some of the letters were especially hard to decipher because they were written in Sütterlin, Old German, and I had difficulty even finding somebody who could read them. The first letters were full of small details, such as where my mother and her parents had lived when growing up in Berlin, or what so-and-so did on their birthday, but soon they became urgent. Please get us out. I was in for a further shock. I discovered that at least according to the Nazis' shifting eugenicist definition of Jewishness, my mother's parents were Jewish, and that they had seen themselves as Jewish, increasingly so, as the Nazis' anti-Semitic measures were brutally enforced. I'd been brought up in a firmly secular household without any trappings of a Jewish heritage, cultural or religious. My parents, in their attempt to anglicize me and keep me safe, had never mentioned their Jewish antecedents. My father, Zeke, had the perfect cover story as to why he and my mother have fled, especially as it was true. He had been a leading member of the Agitprop movement and a director of one of the groups, the Rote Sprachrohr, in early 1930s Berlin. The articles he wrote then about the role and character of Agitprop theatre are still in print to this day. That is why the SS were out to get him. That is why he had to flee. He was very lucky to get out. I mean, this is what he said. Already married, my mother then followed him. They did not leave because of the Nazis' anti-Semitic savagery. I also found photo albums that I had never seen before, most of which had belonged to my father. I sat cross-legged on the floor in my house and stared at the pictures. I did not know who most of them were. I could hardly bear it. Then a thin locket fell out of one of the albums onto the floor and sprang open. I looked down at the two tiny photos which fell out, and they looked at me. What, I wondered, had happened to these two people, whose photos somebody close to my father had carried round their neck. I wanted to reach into history to save them. I started to write down in diary form what I was going through, to explore and express what I was discovering. The diary got longer and longer. One day I thought I'd try to use my notes to write a novel. My semi-autobiographical novel, The Language of Silence, here we go, The Language of Silence, was the result. When The Language of Silence was published, many second-generation people, that is, the children of refugees who were born in Britain, wanted to talk to me. Nobody's ever told my story before. I kept on being told by people who had read the book. Then they told me their stories. Thus, my third book, Breaking the Silence, can you see it?
Yes, yes.
Great. Thus, my third book, Breaking the Silence, which is what we've called my talk, was born. So called because almost everybody I interviewed told me they had never talked to anybody about their family's past as they talked to me. The themes are similar to those in my novel. What is distinctive about the children of refugees from Nazism is the absence of memory, as in The Language of Silence. The people I talk to have been told almost nothing by their parents about what happened to grandparents and wider family. I should add there that, of course, this may not have been a representative sample. It may be that people who had conversations with their families didn't feel the need to talk to me. But anyway, the people I talked to knew almost nothing about their wider families. Even when their parents had told them something, they did so in the broader strokes. How to speak of such things. As in The Language of Silence, the second generation interviewees knew not to ask, knew not to break their parents' silences and hearts. The people I interview learned quickly how asking questions led to their parents getting very upset and very angry. Many of the children felt their parents to be distant and unapproachable. The second generation are profoundly burdened by the absence of a past and what they sense about the deaths of their grandparents. In fact, the people I interviewed talked so much about the absence of grandparents, which I hadn't expected. Anyway, they are left with a deep sense of dispossession and a sense of loss, grief, or pain. Our inheritance is that of emotional and physical insecurity. In a Europe facing the worst refugee crisis since the Second World War, I'm not just talking about Afghanistan, but of course it also includes Afghanistan. Both the language of silence and breaking the silence are poignantly topical. I do hope that enough of today's refugees and their families are not denied a sense of place, of belonging, and can hear the stories of the houses and streets where their grandparents and other kin grew up, the schools they attended and the food they liked the best. I and so many other members of the second generation never heard such stories, never became rooted in a family's past and the feeling of security that goes with it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for sharing your story. Anybody who would like to ask a question, let's use anything in chat, or if you haven't put your question in chat, you will be able to put your hand up. So the first question is, did the speaker have a relative, Miss Moos, who taught Jewish studies at South Hampstead High School in the 1950s?
If I did, I don't know of them. I assume there was somebody with the name Moos. Was it somebody with the name Moos?
Patricia, would you like to unmute and tell us?
Yes, she taught at the school, and I thought it was such an unusual name, so I thought maybe there was a connection.
Well, the thing is that my parents didn't talk to me about their families. So it is actually very possible, because Moos is not a typical German name. In fact, it's a Swiss name. My one part, sort of the male part of my father's family came from Switzerland. And so it is highly unusual, but I don't know the answer. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, next question. There's no questions in chat, so please put your hand up. And if I can see you, I'm Lily.
Yeah, there was a Miss Moos who sent out correspondence lessons in Judaism from the liberal Jewish synagogue in St. John's Wood to children who were not within reach of St. John's Wood. So I was getting these every week or two when I was at school in Wales. But I never gave it a thought from that day to this, but it was a Miss Moos, F-O-O-S.
How extraordinary. That's two people in an audience of 40 or whatever who knew Moses. You're quite right.
I imagine that lady's Miss Moos is my Miss Moos, but maybe we can find out by getting in touch with the LJF. Who knows?
A small world. Right, Marion Black, unmute.
Did your parents never speak German to each other at home?
Yes, they did. Yes, they did. What lies behind your question here?
Well, because didn't you wonder perhaps it was a different language from what you were hearing at school or hearing from other children?
Yes, but my father, I mean, the story my father told was true. I mean, he was a leading activist in the theater. He was. And the SS were after him for that. So that he had a perfect cover story. And my mother left because she was already married to him. In fact, she was also in agitprop. That's how
But when you were growing up, did they not talk to each other in German?
Yes, they did talk to each other in German.
So did you understand any of it? Did you come to understand any German?
They didn't want to teach me German. They developed a hostility towards anything German, which is quite understandable.
Even though they spoke German to each other, because my parents, my mother came from Vienna, my father from Stralsund on the Baltic coast of Germany, and my parents spoke to each other in German, particularly if they didn't want me to understand something.
Right.
But one day, I answered them in English to what they were talking about, and then my mother saw that I understood some German. So they had to be a bit more careful then.
Well done, you.
So I picked up German just from hearing them speak, but I've never had a lesson in it, and I don't know the grammar properly, but it's been quite useful. I just wondered.
I mean, at the beginning, they gave me German kind of fairy stories. And then I think they must have changed policy
Oh,
because
right.
then the German fairy stories stopped and I started getting stories written in English. So, as I say to people, I can talk about ducks waddling in the reeds in German, but that doesn't get me very far.
No, no. And the
Yeah.
other thing I just wanted to say was I never knew any of my grandparents, and I still regret that to this day. Particularly my maternal grandmother. I never knew her. Well, I didn't know any of them, but yeah, I still get upset about that nowadays.
That's right. So they left them. Where did your maternal grandmother live?
They were in Vienna.
They were all in Vienna and they stayed in Vienna.
Well, as long as they could. And as you said, by 1942, my mother didn't hear anymore. And years later, she found out that they had, I don't know what had happened exactly, but in Poland, I don't know if they dropped down dead after the long marches or if they were shot or gassed or what, but it happened in
You ever
Opole.
wanted to find out?
Sorry?
Have you ever wanted to?
No, because I just get too upset about it all. I just burst into tears all the time.
Yes, it's like one lives with it all the time. People don't understand that. I mean, people who haven't been through it don't understand
And
that.
when I was a child, other children would say they were going to their grandmother's or to their
Right.
nanny's house or their nan's house. And I can remember asking my mother and saying, why haven't I got a nan or a grandma? And she would just say, well, she got killed in the war, you know, sort of pass it off a bit like that.
That's right. Evasion.
Yeah, a little
Evasion. They
bit.
got very good at evasion, didn't they?
But when I was older, she did tell me a bit about the background when I was, I don't know, about 11 or so. And we were both just in tears. But my father didn't say very much about his background.
I remember when I was at school once, I mean, I don't know how old I was, say I was 9, and the teacher asked people to draw their families.
Oh.
And I was so upset. I remember because everybody, you know, this was Durham, I mean, grandparents were in their 50s, you know, I mean, it was all a living unit. And all I did was draw me and my 2 parents, and I felt terrible. Yeah, it one really feels it.
Yeah.
Because grandparents are the continuity from the past, and they give you the stories and they provide you with your cultural hinterland, and we didn't have it. I'm sorry, I'm taking over from you.
No, that's
Today's
right.
children,
Thank you.
today's children knows their grandparents and their great-grandparents very often. So that makes it even worse, I suppose. There's always a shortage of family. I know what that feels like.
And also there's a absence of a sense of place, you know. So I grew up in Durham, and I mean, we didn't know a soul in Durham. And you know, so you have no sense of where did your parents grow up, where did your grandparents grow up. That context just isn't there, you know. Sorry, yeah.
I was lucky because my parents came over in March 38 after the Anschluss and managed to get out my father's widowed mother and my mother's parents. So I grew up with 3 grandparents.
Oh, you were lucky.
But most of my parents' friends didn't have that. And I always remember friends of my parents had 2 little boys, and they called not knowing the term grandma, they called her Auntie Granny and Uncle Oppie. They thought they were names, but that's why I called my grandparents. So I was very lucky. But I've done a lot of, my daughter and I have done a lot of research into family and, you know, going back umpteen generations. And so we have found out a lot. My parents, I suppose because they were lucky that their parents survived, they talked a lot about it, and they didn't teach me German. My mother's parents lived with us, so they didn't teach me German during the war because they thought I was too young to understand not to speak in the street.
That's right.
But after that, I learned, and my parents came from Vienna, and it's not what is called Hochdeutsch.
Oh,
It was
wow.
very different. And so my teacher often said to me, I'm getting used to some of your words, because we, in Austria at that time, a lot of French words were used, like plafond for ceiling and trottoir. But under Hitler, they had to clean up no foreign words. And so my teacher said she's getting used to some of my Viennese expressions, but I must ask my parents about one word. I can't remember now what it was, because obviously it was...
Were you in Scotland? Did you grow up in
70 years ago. So
Did you grow up in Scotland?
I
Did you grow up
my mother, and she said, oh, not surprising she didn't know that. That's Yiddish, but to me it sounded like German. So I went on to study languages, so I had the advantage of being bilingual at home, and then learnt French, German, and Latin at school.
That tells me what school you went to. Did you grow up in Scotland? Never mind.
No, I think there was a problem here. Right, I see.
I grew up in London.
In London. Okay, I got another question here from Susan Fagelman.
Apologies, I didn't change.
Oh.
We got a little bit of a problem there.
I was trying to speak, but I was muted. I'm sorry. Is it okay?
Yes, you speak. Okay.
Yeah, I was going to say my father was in 2 concentration camps. He and his brother were taken because my grandfather wasn't at home. He was out on business and they were after him. And he was in 2 concentration camps. Anyway, when he was released, he was interned, as a lot of so-called aliens were.
Enemy aliens, yes.
But what I wanted to say was I contacted the museum there because I didn't have much information about my uncle. I didn't know what happened to him after the camp. And I was surprised that the museum had a lot of information. They told me actually that my father had been interned in the Isle of Man twice. First of all, he'd gone there and then he'd gone to Canada, and I didn't know when he came back he was interned again.
Oh.
So
was he left wing? Was your father left wing?
He was a Zionist.
He wasn't left wing. It's
No.
just the people who on the left were more likely to be sent to Canada, Australia, etc., the Dominion.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, that's all right. Yes, she told me, the curator, that he'd been interned twice, and that upset me. But she tried to reassure me by saying, well, the internees were put in hotels that were made for the First World War participants, whatever you want to call them. So they weren't, you know, anything as bad as camps. But he was lucky to get out, and I only knew one set of grandparents because the others were spread around. I don't have any family now in this country. I'm an only child, and luckily I did make a family tree with my mother before she died, but you know, we still only had smatterings of what happened to my father.
It's hard. It's painful.
But I would urge anybody that, you know, has had parents that were interned, if they need to know this museum does seem to be quite well informed. How, I don't know, but
Which
just want-
museum is it?
the Isle of Man.
Oh,
She's
My
called,
mother was on the Isle of Man and interned on the Isle of Man, amongst other things. And I think she almost enjoyed it, actually. I don't
Really?
think it, yes, I don't think it was that harsh there.
No,
That's my,
no.
at least not for the women. I mean, what she didn't like was that that they were all mixed up together. So the Nazi refugees were mixed up with the non-Nazi refugees. That she didn't like.
well, I think my father got out because he managed to get to university, and he was a civil engineer, qualified civil engineer, and I think he advised them on, you know, certain things. I know he got cigarettes and, you know, quite well looked after, and my uncle became ill and was confined to the sanatorium, and you know, that's how they got out, saved their lives. But, thank you very much for what was your second book called?
Well, I've written a variety of books, but the second book I mentioned was is this the book you meant when you said the second book, Breaking the Silence? Is that what you meant?
I thought that was the third one.
that was your third
No, this
one.
is the third one. My second one, which I didn't show you,
Oh, I
is
see.
this one, which is a book I wrote. It's a biography of my father, Beaten but Not Defeated.
Right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Can we try Susan Fagelman again to see if the sound is better?
Getting more complicated. First of all, apologies for the sound interference, and I didn't manage to change the name to Malcolm Fagelman. It was already on my wife's name, so it's Malcolm Fagelman. And
Okay.
I have a couple of questions, and I have nothing to contribute from my own history because I'm third generation. So it really relates to our speaker's own story. I'm quite interested. I mean, clearly, she's a very intelligent woman, and I have no doubt a very intelligent child. So I just wonder, at what point in her education, in her life, when she was learning about the history of the 20th century, and of course, the period before and during the Second World War, did she start to put two and two together, knowing that her parents were German, came from Berlin, and you know, was she able to actually construct something of a history in her own mind? So that's one question. The other question, slightly different. Clearly, they were living in Durham as a secular, non-observant Jewish family. I just wondered, first of all, was that how they were living in Berlin, or were they living as observant Jews in Berlin? And when she was in Durham, was she identified as a Jew at all, and possibly subject to anti-Semitic comments? So a couple of questions there.
There was nothing ostensibly Jewish about me when I was in Durham. I mean, I think my parents, partly for their own sakes, but they decided that I was strange enough. I mean, you know, I was quite strange in the school. You know, I was middle class, I was articulate. I had a funny accent. I mean, I spoke English, but the kids spotted that I didn't speak English the way they did. And I think my parents decided, partly for my own sake, that they just wouldn't mention Jewishness. So there was nothing whatsoever that was Jewish about the way I was brought up. I also have wondered, how did I not put two and two together? I have wondered that. But I didn't. You know, I mean, I came from a socialist family, and that is why they had fled. And my parents, when I did ask questions about the wider family basically lied. You know, everybody had met some terrible early death due to one illness or another. And I accepted it.
Okay.
But you went to Cambridge. I don't know what subject you studied in Cambridge. What did you study at Cambridge?
I
University?
studied PPE at Oxford.
Right, okay. I mean, clearly by then, I mean, a young undergraduate, you would have known all about the Second World War.
Yeah, but that didn't make
And
me into somebody Jewish. I mean, yes, I did.
No,
I
but
mean,
you made
I
no
had
connection with the
Sorry.
Shoah, with the Holocaust.
No, I was not. I was not. I was not constructed by my parents. It did not see myself as a consequence of the Holocaust. No, I didn't.
Very interesting. Thanks.
Okay. Francis.
Yeah, it's two comments. The first comment is about language. My father came from Radom in Poland, and he wanted to go to a school in Radom that spoke Polish. That was the teaching medium. But when he came here in 1940, he hated the Poles.
1940.
1940, he came to Britain. He came over with the evacuation of the Polish army to Plymouth, which I could write a book about. Nobody knows anything about, but due to research and all about it. But he came in 1940, and his English was his sixth language, but he learned it very quickly. Our next door neighbours were Polish, but he refused to speak to them in Polish. He hated the Poles. And where possible, he tried to meet people that spoke Yiddish. In his later years, when he went to Israel, he used to search out the cafes with all the old men so that he could speak Yiddish. That was his main interest. And when he went into the care home in Manchester, he actually thought that most of the people there would speak Yiddish, and nobody did, which was a great disappointment to him, but he wasn't there very long. But the second point was about research. He did suffer from survivor's guilt. And my uncle was in Israel, but he only spoke French. You see, they've both gone to French universities. So I couldn't communicate. It was very difficult. It was only in later years that my cousin gave me information from my uncle about life in Radom. He didn't have the same attitude to Poles, despite the fact he was just 5 years older than my father. So I knew nothing really about my family, but I went to Radom and I carried out a lot of research. In Poland, it's getting very easy to do research because their archives are very well resourced. And there's various places in America that are actually promoting research at the archives in places like Radom. They have a Radom Society there. So I have pieced the whole thing together, family tree and everything else. I visited the house, the block. I didn't know which house number it was as an apartment block. So I couldn't pinpoint exactly which one it was, because I did fleetingly think of buying it. But then I thought, well, why do I want to be in Poland? I don't speak any Polish. But it was really just for sentimental sake. But it was very difficult to piece it all together. And what I have is a kind of mental picture of the life that they led in Radom, a kind of visual that I have of it. And I don't know if any of it is true, because I'm visualizing how life was for them. You know, he lost all of his family at Treblinka. So there's no point in tracing that because there were only 9 survivors. One of them was from Glasgow, and he wrote a book on it, a very interesting book called Treblinka Survivor. He later committed suicide. He just couldn't take the mental, although he had family and everything else, but it's a fantastic book, but, you know, very, very, very sad, but well worth reading. About somebody who did survive in their life after it. It wasn't written by the survivor. It was actually written by a journalist who now lives, I think, in Florida. but he worked for the Herald in Glasgow as a business editor. Do you know of it, Marilyn?
No, I don't.
I do.
Uh-huh.
I
Oh, you
spoke
know
to-
about?
He spoke at an AGR event. I'll
Uh,
maybe see if he'll come along and speak to everybody about it. There you are.
yeah, that would be good. But really just those comments. I could really identify with what, in a way I could, with what Marilyn was saying. But at the same time, I couldn't really.
How did you feel when you put the research together and visited the sort of ancestral home? Did it help you feel that you were coming to terms with the past? Did it feel unbearable? I mean, how did it feel?
A combination of all those things. It was well after he died, and I wished I'd asked him a bit more about his life in Radham. And unfortunately, because of the language difficulties with my uncle, and I didn't go to Israel very often, I couldn't really find out enough from him. And his son wasn't that interested in asking too much about it. He didn't want to go to Poland, although his wife did, because he was worried about the health service in Poland. He's a cardiologist, and he said, I wouldn't take my family to Poland now. That was some years ago.
Sorry.
I mean, you can only say it's very sad. I had a reason for all of this, and people are probably bored with me telling them about it. There was a letter found in my father's belongings after he died, and it was dated 1947, and it was from his brother to him. And his brother had gone back to Radham because he'd gone back as a refugee, but decided as a doctor he couldn't make a living there. So he went back to Paris after that and eventually went back to Israel. But he mentioned all the names. So I had a lot of leads to follow up. So I knew where the house was, and the archive people were so helpful. So it was like piecing together a book of somebody else, not really me. You see what I mean?
Yeah.
I was one step away from it all the time. But obviously I didn't know my grandmother on that side, but my mother is from Glasgow, so I had a whole family on my mother's side. So
yeah,
they weren't Jewish though, it was only my father that was.
Have you ever thought of writing up about your father?
Well, I'd intended on the basis of this letter to write a play, but life has just got in the way and I haven't done it. It was supposed to be an hour long, and I was thinking of the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and we have a play, A Pint in Glasgow, which is going to restart very soon, but there are an awful lot of plays in the queue, given that we had 2 years without a festival in Edinburgh. So I don't know, I haven't got around to it. I found it was quite painful when I started to write it. I'm living a life that I don't really know, but it's making me very sad. It's very difficult to write it.
Very difficult. I know.
Well worthwhile doing, I think, Frances.
Sorry?
I think it's well worthwhile doing.
Oh, it is. Everybody says to me, I actually, that lady that was on some time ago, she wrote plays to take round schools.
She was a lady from, I think she was
from London. She offered to write it for me if I give her the details, but I felt it was something I had to do, but I just haven't got around to it. Maybe in the future I will, when I've got a less active life.
I hope you do it.
I had 3,000 words of research and I gave it to all my nieces and nephews in America, because at least they've got something to pass on this research, because it will get more and more difficult to actually find anything out in the future. But if I hadn't had that letter from 1947, I would not have had the leads. I wouldn't even have known where he lived in Radham. So I found out a lot about the way the Jews were treated in Eastern Poland at that time.
That was good. That was
I want to encourage you to write the play.
I know, share it with other people.
Okay, thank you very much. Danny, you like to unmute? You need to unmute so we can hear you. Click on your mute.
Sorry, Agnes, I've made a mistake. I don't know how to not put my hand up.
All right, so you didn't want to ask a question. That's
Can
fine.
I just
That's
pass
okay.
on that, please?
Yes, of course, no problem at all.
Thank you. Sorry.
No problem. Veronica, I saw you had unmuted. Did you want to ask a question?
Well, first of all, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well.
Well, I'm really sorry for all those people who never knew their grandparents, especially grandmother, because if I feel Jewish, I always think about my grandmother, but I could never actually manage to find out. Very possible she died in Auschwitz, as 400,000 Hungarians were taken to Auschwitz, as you know. And she left such a big gap in my life that I can still cry to think about her. The last time I saw her was 1942, when I was 10 years old. So it is a terrible loss, you know, not to know your grandparents. And I really feel for everybody who hasn't got that chance. But what I would like to ask Marilyn is, was there any religion in her family? Because obviously Jewishness was not on the card, but did her or the parents did have any religion at all?
No.
No religion at all? No. Okay. It's rather sad. You have to belong somewhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I have a question here from Jonathan Cooper, and he's asking, Marilyn, are you an only child?
That's not as easy to answer as it sounds. My mother was one of 3 sisters, and one of the sisters had a child who got out on the kinder transport, and whom I call Ruthie, although her name is actually Ruth. And my parents, in effect, adopted her. I mean, there was a 15-year gap between us. And so she didn't, well, not so, but she didn't stay very long with my parents because she left after I was born, because she left to go to college. So we only overlapped by 2 to 3 years. So I didn't grow up with a brother or sister, but I have a cousin who is like a sort of sister.
Okay, does this answer your question then, Jonathan?
Thank you.
Okay, anybody else? If I can see your hand up, just unmute and ask your question.
Can I, this isn't a question, it's just a comment.
Yes, of course.
I'm sorry, Marilyn, I missed the beginning of your talk. I was late in joining you. Things happen, but I'm so sorry that I did miss the beginning, but I do know that it's probably been recorded. I wanted to make a comment about Durham and the Jewish community of Durham, because my grandfather on my mother's side came over from Poland, Mariupol, in the very late 1800s with his family, and settled in Durham. And he did, starting as a peddler, he did very, very well. And he was a founder member of the synagogue in Durham. Now, my mother and the rest of her family, and I think the father, yes, my grandfather, moved to Sunderland from Durham, I would think in the late 20s. But there was a very well-established Jewish community in Durham in the early, well before the war. And we were, about 10 years ago, we were in Durham. We were going up north, and we made a point of trying to find the synagogue, because we were told that there was a plaque on the wall with my grandfather's name on. So we went to the tourist office, and they were so helpful. And we did, in fact, find the the old synagogue, which is now a church. And they're very difficult to find. Behind a hedge was the plaque. So I was really quite thrilled. But I mean, I'm going back before, obviously before your family were in Durham, but there was, because my mother was brought up very from, and it was, you know, it was really lovely to go back and see it, because I can remember her talking about there being a railway line nearby, and in the middle of the service the trains would go by, and you could hear them in the instead of the service. And lo and behold, on an embankment just behind the church there was this railway embankment, which is no longer a railway. So, you know, you did remind me of that, Marilyn. I hope you don't mind me telling you.
No, I'm interested.
Good. His name was Berkson, Philip Berkson, but he started as a peddler, and he didn't speak any English. He only spoke Yiddish, and he ended up owning a furniture factory in Sunderland, and he was building during the war all the furnishings for the ships, and he did very well indeed. So amazing people they were.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Myrna.
Yes, Bob McKenzie wants to say something. He had his hand up.
Okay, sorry, I didn't see you, Bob. Can you unmute and ask your question, Bob?
Unmute, Bob.
You need to unmute, Bob. You need to look at your mute icon, which has got a red line across, and unmute.
I'm better. Can you hear me now?
Better, I can hear you, yes.
No, what was, I could understand the lady's problems trying to get the parents to talk. I was in a different situation. I was in a mixed marriage. My father and grandfather were Jewish, but my mother was Lutheran.
Lutheran?
Oh, hello?
Yes, we can hear you. We can hear you, Bob.
Just give me one moment. There's somebody at my door. I'll just go a minute and I'll be back.
We'll
You
come
get
back
somebody
to
else
you.
on while I'm waiting.
We'll come back to you, Bob.
Could I
Eva
just
Clark,
say- yeah,
Eva,
hi.
there you are. Okay.
Hello, Marilyn. Thank you very much for your talk. I find it really very moving and interesting. What I wanted to ask was, presumably, well, no, one can't assume anything. Did you not ask your cousin about the family background?
My cousin couldn't talk. I don't mean she was unable to talk.
No, but she just felt unable.
Could not talk. She has very recently, very recently, and she's now in her 90s, started opening up a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But not only could she not talk, she didn't want anybody else to talk about the past either, really didn't.
Uh-huh.
So,
right.
Yeah.
But also, have you, I'm sure you have, tried to trace, through the German archive, through Bad Arolsen, your family?
Yes, I have. Yes.
Okay, that's, thank you.
You, Eva. I don't think Bob is back yet. Malcolm, did you want to ask another question?
Hello.
Yes, indeed.
Sorry, excuse me. Sorry, Bob is back. I come back to you, Malcolm, in a second. Bob.
No problem.
Carry on then.
Carry on, Bob.
Right. Well, me carry on. Well, as I say, I was in a bit of a problem of mixed marriage. My father and grandfather were Jewish. My mother was Lutheran. And we were actually brought up in the Lutheran faith. But they must have had the warning, because one day my father disappeared, and about a month or so later he came back home, and we discovered he'd been in Buchenwald. And I think my mum and dad got the wind up, and they decided my sister and I should go on the kinder transport. So we went away in the kinder transport, and unfortunately, we couldn't get much history from my parents because we weren't there to ask them. And a lot of the information we got many years later was from my mother's sister, Aunt Gertrude, who gave us some information. And one of the queer things, which I've never been able to prove, but I've been told it is a case, my mother's brother, right, she was married to a Jew, and her brother was one of Hitler's bodyguard. And I said, it's impossible. And there's a friend of mine made inquiries, and there was someone with the same name as my mother actually on Hitler's bodyguard. So I don't know whether it's true or not, you know. But trying to get information is almost impossible once people pass away, because you've got to try and find information from people who might have known them and have got information that they can pass on. And there's many a time where I wish I could have asked my parents, but unfortunately, when we went away in kinder transport in 1938, they were left behind, and I found out later that some civil servant in London had my parents' papers on his desk for 7 weeks before he actually moved them. And I often wonder if that 7 weeks was enough to stop them joining us till after the war.
So did you grow up with your parents after being looked after by other people? Is that what happened?
No, I actually, we came over in the kinder transport, and I went to London, and from there up to memory, up to a Scottish town with the Priory at Selkirk. And from the Priory, it was a holding station. And from there, I must have been about 20, 25. And from there, we're distributed to all different points throughout the country. And I was very fortunate that the couple the couple who chose me, rather, I didn't get any choosing. They chose my sister and I because my parents had asked if we could stay together. And they took us in not as two waifs and strays, but we actually became a nice boy and girl of the family, and were treated exactly the same as his own 3 daughters. And when no male descendants at all, when I took British nationality, I actually thanked him for the life he gave me in start by taking his name. It's the only way I could repay him, because he taught me all the basics. And one of the things that has stuck to me all these years and years and years, and he always impressed on me, he says, if you don't have a pound, don't spend it. And you know, it's logical, because I've never been in debt, touch wood. And it's a thing that's stayed with me all these years. But I was very fortunate, the family that took us in and brought us up.
Have you ever thought of writing up your story?
The one?
Have you ever thought of writing up your story?
I used to do talks throughout the Central Belt of Scotland. There, various schools, groups, Women's Guild and all that, you know. But since I lost my wife, I'm afraid I've kind of curtailed it a bit. And then my sight's gone, so I've had to give up the car. So that's my transport disappeared right away. So I'm curtailed quite a bit. But it's been interesting. But I've often wondered, you know, is there any truth in the story that my mother was married to a Jew and yet her brother was part of Hitler's bodyguard?
I think that's quite possible. Unlikely, but possible.
Is it?
Yep. I mean, there were Jewish people who did support Hitler, who worked for him. Yes, there were.
Well, she wasn't
not your
Jewish.
fault.
No, my mother wasn't Jewish. She was Lutheran, you see. So her brother would be the same, Lutheran. He wouldn't be Jewish. But I've often wondered what the truth was.
Myrna.
Yes, just to add to Bob's story, although he hasn't written his story is on something called Gathering the Voices. And it's a fascinating story, and he hasn't told you the whole story. And if you want to hear about it, you read his story in Gathering the Voices, because it's very interesting.
Thank you.
Yes. Malcolm.
Okay. Yeah, well, this is an observation, really. It's something that had troubled me for quite a long time. I mean, I've read widely about the mid-20th century, about the war, the Holocaust, and of course about the first and second generation survivors. In fact, I've actually got a book by a friend who's a clinical psychologist, and she's written a book, actually. She did a thesis on the difficulties and problems of second generation children of Holocaust survivors. Very interesting. But the thing that always interested me is that, as I mentioned, I'm third generation. My grandparents came from Poland, White Russia, that's Belarus, and Russia. And they all arrived either at the very end of the 19th century or the beginning of the 20th century. And what little I knew about my grandparents, I knew that they arrived as escapees, if you like, from, wasn't a Shoah, but they were suffered terribly and great persecution at the time of the pogroms in the late 19th century. And, you know, I kind of assumed as a youngster that they arrived almost like as a bubble, as an isolated family with no background, and there was no discussion about their background. And of course, they lived right through the 20th century, through the war. And it was only later when I became properly interested in reading widely about the war and the Shoah, that I started to wonder what happened. They must have had relatives. And I took my grandfather's home in Poland, a town called Pultusk, which has got a population of about probably a third of the size of Durham. So it's a reasonably sized town. And I looked at the family name on the Yad Vashem website. Their name in England was Silverstone, but they left, my grandfather left as Zilberstein. And I found for the first time only a few years ago that probably 6 or 7 of their family under the name of Zilberstein were all murdered. And there was never any discussion about having any family in Poland still there. And no doubt the rest of those East European countries, Belarus and Russia, there was no discussion. There was also, like after the Holocaust, there was a conspiracy of silence. Right. And I found it absolutely distressing, really, that I never spoke to my parents or my grandparents about this conspiracy of silence. Nobody had ever mentioned to me that I had probably uncles and aunts or great uncles and aunts and cousins that were all murdered there. And I had no idea and never any discussion in the family. And I actually ran up past Professor Dina Porat, who was an Israeli professor of Holocaust studies, and she was surprised. She didn't know that certainly in countries like the UK that there was this sort of conspiracy of silence. There we go.
Yes.
Thank you. Marion.
Yes, hello. I just wanted to say thank you to Marilyn. It was a really wonderful talk. I identified as well as everybody else here did, because my mother never spoke a word about her Viennese family, parents and so forth. And only long after she died, when I was middle-aged, I sought the information from Bart Arolsen in Germany, received an immense amount of information, and then pursued it all the way to where they were all, or nearly all, murdered in Riga. And it was a very poignant and incredible journey. So I identify with what you say about the silence and the
Thank you.
unwillingness to talk about it.
Thank you. Gloria.
Hi. I too missed the beginning of your presentation, which is a shame because I didn't really know where it was going. But yeah, just to share some information about myself. I'm the daughter of a kinder transport child who came in last transport in 1939. And interestingly, although all the records and all the things that I've ever heard about say that the only children that came across as kinder transport were fit, healthy children that were able to be fostered or adopted by English people. My mum, contrary to that, was what you might call a disabled person. My mum is profoundly deaf, always been a sign language user, and she came across with 10 school children to England on the kinder transport and was
from Germany or from where?
From Berlin. From Berlin.
From Berlin.
Yeah. So she came not being able to speak either English nor English Sign Language. Was sent to school, had a very low, she was sent to a boarding school to grow up, had a very lonely childhood, which kind of torments her to the day, especially now she's older. She's now in palliative care and she's kind of remembering, I don't know if they're false memories or if they're real memories, but she's remembering. But I think the thing that I want to say was quite different from what I'm hearing a lot of people say. My mum didn't stop talking about it. And I was very resentful of my Jewish identity and very resentful of the deafness because I just had it thrust down my throat all the time. And when the restitution claims went in, I was 10 years old and I had to act as my mum's interpreter, which was quite traumatic, and nobody gave a damn about how a 10-year-old child would feel about interpreting about Hitler. But anyway, I think I've grown up quite rounded. But what I also wanted to say is it must be about 3 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, the Stolperstein Museum in Berlin contacted me to say, was my mother and her brother still alive, because they found out that they were kinder transport. I didn't know what a Stolperstein was. Do people know what Stolpersteins are?
Yes.
Okay, well, I had no idea what a Stolperstein was. So we were invited over to Germany, and that has proved to be the most amazing resource for me finding about my family history. There's a girl there that liaises with me regularly. She's on a mission. I think she quite likes my family history. But what was really sad was my mum grew up thinking that she lived with her mum. Her dad was divorced, and that was their family unit. But in fact, what we found out from the museum was that my mum was my grandmother, so her mother was one of 12 children who she knew nothing about. And the amazing thing is, my mum came to England, her mum was killed by the Nazis and her father was killed by the Nazis, but all other 11 of them survived, which was heartbreaking for my mum to find out at the age of, I think she was 89 when she found out, too old to go and visit them, too infirm. And I think that's so tragic. And now she's getting older and she's in palliative care. She's now grieving for the family that she had, but didn't know she had, who survived the war. But just think it's amazing that 11 brothers and sisters survived and only my mum's parents died.
How was it that she was brought over? I mean, because that's very interesting, because I didn't know.
People say there were no disabled people came across.
Right.
But yes, my mum was one of 10. I believe they were probably the only disabled people that came across. Of course, deaf people don't consider themselves disabled, but
no, leaving aside the concept
those days they would have been labelled as disabled. They came across sponsored by the school. I mean, there is a story There's quite an interesting backstory that I heard from somebody else, that one of their party that came across was actually they were brought across by their headmaster at the German school for the deaf, but he brought along it's true, I know it's true. He brought along the daughter of an SS soldier who posed as a Jew on the Kindertransport. I don't know what happened thereafter, but so that's how they think that the teacher was allowed to bring the 10 children across because they were smuggling a German child, an SS child through, probably quite an important SS soldier. And she spent the rest of her life in England, but died quite a long time ago. So.
Have you ever thought of writing this up?
Well, I've only found out about this history literally in the last 4 years. And I'm an extremely busy person. And I am aware it's a very, very, and there's lots of facets to it that is very interesting. But I just don't really have the wherewithal and nor the time to do it. Maybe when
it would take you years.
It would. And I don't know that.
It's what you want to do with your life.
But I don't know if I want to expend that energy.
Yeah. On the past.
And I'm certainly not going to do it while my mum's alive because it would break her heart. But the interesting thing is, she's got Stolpersteins, and I don't know if people know that this is possible, but it's now possible to have Stolpersteins for Kindertransport. And my mum and her brother, who came across with her, well, he was one of the 10 because he's profoundly deaf as well. They now have Stolpersteins outside the house where they lived, and it says Kindertransport, which is quite touching. So, yeah.
Gloria. I have somebody asking, Stephen Jacobs would like to know what a Stolperstein is. Would you like to explain?
I don't know that I'm the best person to say, am I?
Well,
I'll explain. I'll explain if you like.
Okay. Yeah, you can explain, Marilyn.
It started, I don't know, perhaps 10 years ago, 15 years ago. It started almost kind of like a bit of free enterprise, that this couple got permission from the council or whatever in Berlin to lift up the stones and put in a carved stone which has the essential details of the person who was killed not in terms of the Kindertransport, but in the past, outside of the house where they had lived, so that if you walk around Berlin, you will find thousands of Stolpersteine, and it's something which is really spread, and it's even spread outside Germany. But I didn't know that it was also now being used for Kindertransport. I'm very glad it is. I mean, it is a bit controversial. I'm entirely in favor of it, but some people don't like it because it means that the stones are being walked upon, and they think that's degrading. But I think it's wonderful because they're there in front of you and you see them. Does that explain it?
I could try and search, if I'm allowed to screen share, I could search on my database and find a photograph and put it up there.
Yes, okay.
Okay, well, you keep talking and I'll tell you what I found.
Your name is Gloria, so I need to make you a co-host.
Okay.
Okay, let me just find
I'm just looking for where I can find it.
If you want to show a picture.
Does anybody else want to ask or say anything while she's looking?
Just unmute and ask a question in case I can't see you.
Isa Brish.
Thanks very much for that explanation. Very much, Stolperstein. Thank you very much.
Oh.
Okay, anybody else?
Isa Brish.
Josephine, you got another question?
No, it's Isa Brish that our good friend that used to live in Bournemouth. is trying to get attention.
Okay, just ask your question.
Right. Hello, everybody.
Hello, Isa.
I'm Isa Brish, and I was born in Germany, and I've got my story told on the Gathering of Voices. And I know that Josephine Jackson and myself have been talking about the Holocaust on many occasions. My father and mother both were born in Germany. I knew my maternal and paternal grandmothers. My maternal grandmother was very active, very well. My paternal was not. Both were killed, the paternal one in one of those vans, and my maternal grandmother in Theresienstadt. But I didn't want to talk about that, and I didn't want to talk about my own story because that's far too long. But I did want to ask Marilyn that since she's found out all these details and now grown up from being a child to an adult to a very intelligent and well-versed lady, that have you any affinity at all with Judaism or the Jewish people or Jewish culture or anything like that at all?
That's a very, very broad question. I mean, I would say that I didn't, although I didn't know it, there were aspects of the way that my parents were and behaved to me, which were steeped in Jewish culture. But that's quite different from religion, which there was no sign of whatsoever. So, you know, I mean, that emphasis, not all Jewish people at all, but some or many Jewish people have an emphasis on ideas and understanding, which got passed straight on to me, you know, as if through osmosis. But I mean, what I now call myself is historically Jewish, because there was nothing Jewish ostensibly about the way I was brought up. I mean, nothing at all. So I don't know if that answers your question.
In a way, yes, but in a way, no. Do you have any feeling towards Israel or towards Jewish values?
I think my views on Israel would not agree with most other people's views on Israel here. I certainly do not identify as this Israel.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Okay. All right. Gloria, sorry. Gloria,
Yeah.
have you found one?
Okay. I think I should be able to find it.
Right, just share your screen.
Right, hold on. Hold on.
Share your screen.
Can you see
Okay.
that?
Yes, we can see. Yeah, there you are.
Yes,
That's
you can see
exactly
that.
what we are.
So the first one is my grandmother, second one my mother's brother, and the last two are another brother and my mother, and you can see it says Kindertransport on it. So, but for those that don't know, the Stolpersteins is here lived Charlotte Marshall, born Cone, the date of the birth, where they were deported, the date they were deported, where they were deported to, and then where they and on to, and then when they died. So
although it isn't always able to say when they died.
No, of course not. Yeah. But that's so yeah, for those that didn't know what Stolperstein was, but it feels nice to have one there actually. So
thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, right. Anybody else? Anybody else? If I can see you, just unmute and ask your question. No, I think perhaps We've had all the questions, Marilyn. In which case, all that's left for me to do is to thank you very much, Marilyn, for joining us today and telling us your story and talking about your books and being a second generation. And thank you everyone who joined us and for all your contributions. And I think it was a wonderful meeting. Thank you very much, everybody. And I hope to see you again another time. Bye for now. Bye-bye.